Hi, everybody. Thanks to everyone for coming. I'm going to do a quick introduction while a couple of people roll in to the webinar today. So I'm Eliza Berry. I'm Marketing Director at Richey May Technology Solutions. And today we're going to talk about the top 3 cybersecurity threats to the finance industry, which I think you'll find are 3 really interesting threats, especially since everything in cybersecurity is always changing. So JT Gallardo from Richey May Technology Solutions is going to talk to you kind of about the state of cybersecurity and why these particular threats are relevant to finance kind of tech professionals, but also just really, leaders of mortgage companies, financial services companies in general. And then Brian Donahue from Red Canary is going to talk about some insights from their threats report, so that we can dig into what those actual top 3 threats are that you should be preparing for through the rest of the year and beyond that. I will be down in the chat and questions panel, so if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to ask them. I'll either stop JT and Brian if the topic is super relevant to whatever slide they're on, but we're also going to have about 10 or 15 minutes to ask questions at the end. So feel free to get those in at any time. We are recording the webinar. You will have access to the recording and the slides. We'll send everybody an email, everybody that registered. Feel free to share those with anyone that you think might benefit from this, especially any of those, CIO, CTO type people, or even your curious CEOs and CFOs who might be, really thinking about beefing up their cybersecurity strategy here, towards the end of the year or at the beginning of next year. I know the end of busy season is a common time for mortgage companies. So again, thank you for joining us. And with that, take it away, JT.
Thanks, Eliza, and thanks, Brian, for being here today. And thanks everyone for joining us. Just diving in to our presentation here. A little bit about Richey May Technology Solutions. We're a full services advisory group. Richey May has been in business since 1985. And within our technology solutions group, we offer everything from cybersecurity services, cloud services, out to business intelligence and budget and forecasting. I lead the cybersecurity practice with the firm. And my primary focus is is advising and supporting our clients on either a temporary basis or as a fully managed service, and everything in between, regardless if it's incident response, audit support, or other consulting needs. Brian?
Yes, I am Brian Donahue. Thank you guys for having me on here. So I am on the community team at Red Canary. Prior to that, I've been in InfoSec for about 10 years. I got my start as a journalist for what was then a brand new news outlet called Threat Post. Now is sort of a pretty well-established news outlet. From there, I became a cyber threat intelligence analyst. And then I eventually joined Red Canary, where I do a lot of content production, lots of education. So I play a significant role in producing our blog. I'm one of the lead writers on our annual threat detection report, which we're going to talk about in some depth here today. And then I also help out with webinars, whether I'm producing them or I am on them. So I write and talk and produce things that are about security. So just to give you guys some background on what it is exactly that Red Canary does, Red Canary is a managed detection and response provider. So we ingest telemetry from our customers' endpoints. And I think, I'm not 100% certain what the exact number is, but we ingest about a petabyte of telemetry every day or so. So from that petabyte of telemetry, we ingest it into our engine and we parse it against a series of detection rules, like maybe 2,000 or 3,000 detection rules. And those detection rules are looking for patterns of telemetry that are associated with malicious behaviors. So when we find a pattern of telemetry that matches the malicious behavior that one of those detection rules is supposed to trigger on, That sends an event to our detection engineering team. They investigate it, and if it's a confirmed malicious threat, they send it over to the customers. So that's a pretty high level look at it. In a little bit more depth, we're collecting this telemetry from EDR sensors, and those EDR sensors are primarily from Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, Microsoft Defender ATP, and then we have some in-house tooling that can collect telemetry as well. And when I say telemetry, what we're talking about is primarily process metadata. So things like process execution, process ancestry, file modifications, network connections, command line parameters, and the binaries associated with those things. So that all gets ingested by the engine. And meanwhile, our threat intelligence, research, and detection engineering teams are continually developing behavioral analytics to catch malicious behaviors. So the engine runs all that telemetry against the behavioral analytics. It tosses out activity that's uninteresting. It moves potential threats to a sort of analyst workbench where our detection engineering team can then investigate that telemetry in context. They then toss out the false positives, and they send confirmed threats into the customer portal to inform our customers that there's been a detection in their environment. Once that happens, there's a number of automated response actions they can take. I'm going to go over a few of those in a minute, but also at the same time, they can get assistance from the incident handling team at Red Canary, which is sort of a team of like CISOs on call almost that have pretty broad knowledge of security, and they're able to help across the customer's security stack. So where the detection engineering team is really sort of laser focused on finding threats in endpoint telemetry, the incident handlers are more broadly able to go in and talk about sort of other parts of their security infrastructure. And I'll show you guys a little bit later in this webinar kind of what a detection looks like. But as I said, once a detection gets published, there's a variety of automated actions you can take. This is one such playbook. So as you can see here, some of the things that you're able to automate after a detection involve communication. So you can mark a detection as acknowledged, you can send an email, but there's also a variety of containment actions like banning file hashes, killing processes, deleting or capturing files. And then you can also collect forensics packages, which are effectively snapshots of a disk image at the time that a threat occurred. You can also isolate endpoints, forward things along to a SIM. There's quite a few endpoint actions you can take, and they're all contingent on metadata within the detection itself. So in this case, this playbook is set to trigger when the detection severity is high, the endpoint type is a workstation, and the secondary threat classification indicates that it is a strain of ransomware. So what was that?
Brian, I was gonna say, I'd like to stop you right here because this is a piece that I think is extremely critical, and especially you just started touching on it around the ransomware piece. But if you think about some of the attacks that have been facing the financial services industry as a whole in the United States, especially since it's about midsummer last year, right? We've seen a massive increase in ransomware events, and as we've got more and more folks working from home, right, we're not kind of protected by that traditional castle that we all kind of hide behind, our layers of firewalls and other network level detections. And so being able to automate the detection and isolation and prevention, or I should say remediation of things like ransomware that are coming to the door really moves the needle for folks, especially in today's climate when a lot of your assets are not in that traditional infrastructure realm. And so this is a really interesting element of the Red Canary platform for sure.
Yeah, and to your point, we've had a lot of conversations on our end, both internally and in sort of virtual conversations with customers and prospects about sort of the increased importance of things like identity management and endpoint security as we've gone into this remote world. But the fact that you brought up ransomware is interesting, and I hadn't thought about what I'm about to say until right now, but the collect forensics containment action is probably really important or could be potentially very important. I don't know how much mileage you guys get out of it, but I'm just thinking in terms of like the new trend now, which is not just, at first it was lock down one machine, demand payment. Then it was, move laterally, lock down all the machines, demand payment. And now it's like move laterally, lock down everything, pull data out of the environment, and then threaten to leak the data if they don't pay the ransom. So like there's this extortion element to it too. So this idea of being able to collect a forensics package is incredibly important when you're dealing with the potential for for exfiltrated data, right?
Yeah, that's a excellent point, right? And those trends where we actually just worked a case for a client a couple weeks back where it was exactly that scenario. They moved laterally, but they didn't lock down every machine. They locked down specific machines, right? They sat on the network long enough to realize where the high value assets were, and then they also took a tremendous amount of non-public information about clients, and that was really the tipping point. The organization said, "Hey, yes, these key systems are locked out. We can get around that through our business continuity and disaster recovery planning. However, when it comes to light that, hey, they also have this information or potentially have this information, we need to prove or disprove that this was exfiltrated from the environment. Having this tool there would have been extremely helpful because then they could decide, well, these guys are just blowing smoke, or nope, they really do have some really pertinent information that they could leak and damage us with. And so that's definitely the trend moving forward, right? Because they really want to instill that sense of urgency for you to pay. And it's all about the monetization for sure.
Yeah, and I think this is a good segue into like the next thing you were going to talk about, which is kind of the state of cybersecurity right now.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Brian. And so what's interesting and what you see here in the slide is data that we've that Richey May pulled from two different reports, one being the annual Verizon data breach report that looks at the year prior, so this would be 2019 data, as well as the FBI IC3 report. And what's interesting is that throughout 2019, what we saw was that financial services became the #1 targeted industry from a cyber attack perspective, and it actually displaced the public sector or the government sector in the 2019 report, which was the first place target. And the reason for that is that to really harken back to the days when there was bank robbers went to the banks. Why? Because that's where the money was. Cyber criminals are going to the financial services industry because that's where the money is. And there's a lot of and when we think about the financial services industry, it's really easy for us to think about companies like JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, things of that nature. But there's a lot of mid-market companies that fill in a vast majority of that market segment, and they don't have the budgets of the Wells and the JPMCs of the world. They also don't have the eyes on glass, and quite frankly, they're moving tremendous sums of money, right? If you think of originating a mortgage and the volumes, especially now with the rates being extremely low, it's not uncommon for several hundred million to $1 billion worth of face value with the loans being originated in a given month. So then you start thinking about appraisal fee transfers, earnest money transfers, deposits for those loans, things of that nature. Those are large sums of money that if the bad guys can insert themselves into that transaction, they can profit pretty easily. The Honeyman Institute out of Michigan. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, I was just going to say, so I'm not I don't have a ton of experience working with sort of smaller and regional banks, but I did work with some of the larger ones back in my threat intel days, and I'm wondering, to what extent do you, and it seemed like they sort of had the ability to buy every tool, very, very sophisticated. So I wonder if there's two things that are also contributing to these sort of disproportionately high the fact that they account for a disproportionately high amount of cyber attacks. And I'm wondering if, and it's government and financial services, and I'm wondering two things. One, financial services, they have great visibility, they have great tooling. So I wonder if to some extent, The reason they have so many cyber attacks isn't just because they're getting attacked more, but also because they're aware of it. And then on the flip side of that, and the second point will account for government as well, like they have to report cyber attacks, right? They're bound by a lot of regulatory rules.
That's an absolute two interesting points. And on the second one, at least on the financial services side, they're definitely bound by compliance and regulatory law to disclose. What's interesting though, believe it or not, not every public sector entity has to disclose if they've had an incident. States are actually working on rectifying that. There's a lot of legislation being passed at the state level to ensure that data disclosure laws apply to the public entity groups. So that's actually just an interesting fact that came to light just about a month ago. We were working a different incident for a public sector organization, and we started asking about the disclosure piece, and they're like, well, technically we're not bound by that because of the type of organization we are in the state that they operated in. So that's just kind of an interesting factoid, and I was kind of blown away by that because every state does have a data disclosure law, but the way that those laws are written state by state may actually exclude the public sector. But you're right.
That's interesting.
I think knowing that the sky is blue and it's going to be sunny from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. daily, and being aware of that and keeping track of it over time, you're going to have more data and statistics than some of the less mature organizations, especially in like retail and healthcare and manufacturing, right? In those sectors, they aren't traditionally known for having robust security programs. So they may have a similar proportional number of cyber attacks, right? They just might not know it or keep good data on it. So that's actually a very fair point. The last little piece here that I wanted to touch on is that the FBI has a incident handling center, and one of the big pushes that they've done within that group is tracking ransomware attacks and trying to be a public resource. And so while the U.S. government's stance, and this includes the FBI, is that you should never pay a ransom, if you happen to pay a ransom or are in the event having a ransomware attack, one of the best options for you to do is actually contact your local FBI field office, because for many of these attacks, if the keys are centralized, or if the key server's been taken over by the law enforcement groups, they'll give you the recovery tokens for the type of ransomware if they have them. So that's one area that for folks that don't have good ransomware mitigation strategies, that we make recommendations. Call your local field office. You don't have to file a case. You just ask them if they have the keys for the variant that you're infected with. If they do, they'll provide it to you, and there's no investigation, there's no charge. This is something that they do to try to support the community. But in 2019, what they did is they did identify just about 2,100 organizations that got hit with ransomware, right? So that's not 2,100 systems, right? That's 2,100 unique attacks that companies faced throughout the year. So there's definitely a large increase, and probably one of the number one monetary making scenarios that cyber criminals have right now. And so, I think we've kind of beaten this drum quite a bit, but most of these attacks are all financially motivated. And again, pulling some statistics from the Verizon Data Breach Report, most of this is organized crime, not crim. And some of it is actually nation state as well. And there's a lot of really good literature out there about the nation state threat and why governments fund clandestine cybersecurity programs. But the vast majority of this is definitely financially motivated, because it's not a victimless crime, but it's not a violent crime that's going to result in extreme punitive damages in many cases. So that's why organized crime has really thrived in this space, because they can operate with very little impact or risk of being caught. And again, what do the numbers really look like, right? And so this is actually some older statistics the FBI had, but if we go back to 2018, internet-enabled theft, right? So this is anything from ransomware to wire transfer fraud, things of that nature, led to just under $3 billion in financial loss, and that's just in the U.S. Globally, there are statistics somewhere around 61 to $62 billion annually. And the scary thing is when you really dig into groups like mortgage banking and real estate firms, because they actually track this separately at the IC3. There was just a little over 11,000 victims of wire fraud, right? So it was like going back to talking about those appraisal fees, those deposits, those earnest monies, being able to convince a consumer to wire the money to the wrong spot, led to nearly a loss of $150 million, and that was in 2019, and that was up 3 times from what it was in 2017. Right, so that's a pretty impactful number.
It's also interestingly 5 times the number of victims of ransomware, right? So like you don't hear as much about wire fraud, but it is far more widespread. Maybe not as costly, but definitely still like right on par with as big of a problem.
You're spot on, and what's interesting is that having many of us here on this presentation probably hit up at least 3 or 4 times this week alone, right? With the low mortgage rates, we're historical lows around 3%, and so it's created a lot of urgency in the marketplace because most people can refinance, and that could be either refinancing their home or refinancing with some cash out and restructuring their debt. And so with that sense of urgency, because rates fluctuate, again, the bad guys know they can insert themselves into that scenario because consumers are trying to act with the timely nature of the rates being where they're at. And so it's very easy for them to say, okay, well, hey, if you really want to close at this time, we've changed up the wire transfer instructions, please send your money here. And that's a lot of what we see, and typically it's focused on smaller organizations such as title companies or regional banks that might have a business email compromise where the bad guys can sit there and pick off different deals with near impunity without being caught.
Admittedly, I think about information security every day, and even I am a little bit befuddled sometimes dealing with sort of real estate transactions. Like it's just hard. It's really hard to parse like what's real from what's not real when you're doing that.
Well, and the industry too, as a whole, is moving towards more of a digital communication method. Meaning, we're seeing a lot of lenders try to talk to consumers by SMS and text message, not just email. And so as we continue to kind of move to more of a digital lending experience, more like what we see in the fintech space, you're going to have consumers, trusting different methods of communication as being secure, right? And that's where I think as the bad guys continue to watch that trend, they're going to insert themselves in those conversations. I mean, we worked a case where consumer was convinced to transfer money through a business email compromise, but the consumer actually questioned it when the email came in, saying, "Well, this doesn't seem right. I thought you told me we weren't going to be, changing the wiring terms." And the attacker instantly switched to SMS because the consumers, they had the consumer's cell phone as part of the email thread back and forth, and that transfer of going to text message put the consumer at ease enough that said, "Oh, this really must be my, part of the loan process. The person's got my cell phone number," and they went ahead and executed, right? So those are the kinds of things that the human element coming into play really is, where we see security also failing a little bit. And again, talking about that human element, that's really what drives most of these attacks, right? We've gotten pretty good since the late 90s having multiple layers of technical security. But we still rely on ourselves, the people, in that process to do the right thing. And the bad guys know that more often than not, if they can instill some sort of urgency in your mind, that's going to lead to them having a beneficial outcome. And it could be anything from, hey, you can't close on this loan, to hey, we had a mistake in your W-2, open this attachment, to hey, there's something wrong with your 401k, please log in here. These are all things that especially in uncertain economic times, will create some sense of urgency for people to react. And that's when you start seeing either fraudulent communication, so wire fraud, password compromise, which we'll talk about a little later, or the installation of malware, and that could be ransomware or other tools used for nefarious purposes and continuing the attack further.
Yeah, so like looking at the way that the Verizon data breach report counts, sort of ranks like styles of hacking, is kind of an interesting transition into what we're going to be looking at throughout the rest of this this webinar. So for the Red Canary threat detection report, we try to sort of rank and stack threat techniques categorized by MITRE attack to figure out like what things happen most often, as opposed to what things happen less often. But before we get into that, I don't know if all of you or some of you are familiar with MITRE attack, so I'll just briefly explain it. So MITRE attack is effectively a taxonomy of threats, and it tries to categorize and describe all of the techniques that an adversary might leverage in an attack. It sort of takes this nebulous idea of a threat landscape and places some bounds on it. So MITRE attack has many use cases, but the primary ones are probably evaluating visibility and detection coverage. And if you are a close follower of MITRE attack, then you probably would recognize that this is an out-of-date version of the matrix. They have since moved on to sub-techniques. So the matrix looks very different now from what it looks like here on the screen, but we are we're dealing with our threat detection report from last year. So we haven't quite updated to sub-techniques, although I think we updated our backend like yesterday. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to be talking about it in the context of, sorry, there's a clawing on my window. Hopefully you can't hear that too loudly. So working from home, it's a nightmare. So we try to rank and stack these things. So you guys saw a version of this this image earlier, but in the context of the threat detection report. So based on 2019, we were parsing about 200 billion pieces of endpoint telemetry on a daily basis. When those ran into our engine and were parsed against our detection analytics, it spit out about 6 million investigative leads. So it created about 6 million event blocks. Now, not all of those were investigated by our detection engineering team. Some of them are handled by bots. Some of them are handled by the detection engineers themselves. But ultimately, they consolidate those down to 15,000 confirmed threats. Now, for the purposes of this report, we excluded potentially unwanted programs like adware, and we only focused on malicious and suspicious categorized threats. So from there, that's consolidated down into the one threat detection report that kind of looks at everything we've seen across our customer base for the entire year. So to give you some idea of like what is within an individual confirmed threat detection in the Red Canary portal, so each of those 15,000 confirmed threats is going to include a variety of important information. What you're looking at now is the threat description, and it's like kind of like a headline, or maybe you could sort of compare it to a lead. But basically, as you can see here, if you got a confirmed threat from Red Canary, it would tell you like what happened from a high level. In this case, this is just a demo machine, but the certificate authority utility downloaded and executed a copy of Mimikatz. So if you were to scroll down further into the sort of threat, the confirmed threat detection, you would get a write-up with like a variety of information about the techniques used. So this is important in the context of the threat detection report because these techniques are MITRE attack techniques. So in this case, you can see it looks like there were 4. There's really only 2 techniques here. It was credential dumping and remote file copy. Remote file copy straddles 3 tactics. So when you looked at that MITRE attack matrix, the tactics are the columns, and then the rows are the techniques. So for the purposes of our report, we basically just went through and counted up those techniques and tried to figure out which ones were occurring most often. As you can also see here, we have the detectors also, which detectors are the behavioral analytics or the detection rules I was talking about. So this is a good example of how for any confirmed threat that Red Canary finds in a customer environment, we try to have multiple detectors associated with it. So that way we've got good defense in depth against these behaviors. And then the last thing is sort of the lowest level part of a detection, which is literally a timeline of exactly what happened. So you can see where the threat occurred. We've got cert util spawning Mimikatz, and then you can also see here where the threat itself was detected. So from 15,000 of these, we were able to create this top 10 of the most prevalent techniques. Now, this is specific to finance. The whole report, the report has an industries section. That's where this was pulled from. But the overall top 10 is slightly different than this. I think it's like eight out of these 10 are the same though. So I'm going to ask you, JT, like, does this sort of track with what you guys are observing on your end, this top 10?
Sorry, I was having a mute button issue there. And I will say, yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that we see from an abuse perspective is by far and wide is on the scripting side. So both, PowerShell and other types of malicious scripts that get executed. And especially on the credential dumping side, it's still, I'd say that the best way to combat that, right, is using multi-factor authentication, but there's still a lot of organizations that don't use that on a prevalent scale. And so the credential dumping and password theft issue is still, by far and large, for instance, like the state level, or I should say the government level incident that I was talking about with the business email compromise, that was all driven by credential dumping. As a root cause. And so that's really where I think a lot of organizations between that and good scripting control that kind of fall over and fall prey to these threats.
Yeah, so I'm going to sort of dive into some more depth on the top 3 of these techniques here in a second. But if you were to grab a copy of the threat detection report, and surf over to this technique page. So we basically took the top 10 most prevalent threats overall and wrote analysis pages on them that include things like why are adversaries using the technique? What data sources do you need to collect from if you want to be able to observe them? What are some useful detection analytics that you can use to reliably detect the threats? And then we recently added a section on sort of testing with this open source adversary emulation tool we've developed called Atomic Red Team. However, for finance, 8 of these 10 techniques have analyses written on them. So the only 2 here that we don't have a full analysis page written on are service execution and MSHTA. But let's jump into the top 3 here. So number 1 for finance is PowerShell. In the overall rankings, it was number 4. Interestingly, though, more than half of all of the organizations that we're monitoring had a PowerShell-related confirmed threat in their environment. So if you were to count these techniques by the number of organizations affected, PowerShell is number one. So that's nearly 1,900 confirmed threats. That accounted for 10% of all threat volume in 2018. It bumped up slightly to 12% in 2019. So why do adversaries like to use PowerShell? For one, it's basically installed by default on nearly every Windows system in the world. It's dynamic and it's powerful. You can do a lot of stuff with it. Administrators use it all the time, and they use it in ways that can be weird and difficult to baseline for. So, it blends in. It's useful for doing lots and lots of system administration. Turns out adversaries like it for the exact same reason that systems administrators like it. And then compounding that, it's kind of like a core part of a lot of really prominent attack toolkits, including Invoke Mimikatz, Metasploit, Cobalt Strike, PowerShell Empire, among many others. So what do you need to be able to observe it? And like as a sidebar, we were talking about MITRE ATT&CK a minute ago. One of the most interesting things to me about MITRE ATT&CK is that when you click through to a technique page in MITRE ATT&CK, one of the pieces of information that is displayed is data sources. So MITRE has tried to tie the data sources that you can use to observe a technique to each of the techniques in its matrix. So in our threat detection report, we kind of took their data source information and sort of added further information about it, like which ones are best. Did they not add any that they should have? But we're coming at this from a very endpoint-centric view of the world, so you should take that into account. But from our perspective, we have found that there's no single source that provides holistic visibility into PowerShell, but you can kind of layer different sources on top of each other and collect from all of them in a way that is that will help you build strong detection. So, and I should note several times throughout this presentation that I am not a detection engineer. However, I have spent a lot of time looking through our analytics library. I've spent a lot of time analyzing our detections at scale, so I have a decent idea of what detections, what detection criteria have been useful for our team. And I've also spent a ton of time, probably more importantly, I've spent a ton of time talking to our detection engineers and our threat intelligence teams sort of about how they detect these things. And kind of these are the collection this is the collection guidance that they've kind of come back to me with. So anti-scam malware interface will detect malicious PowerShell, but it can lack context. Script block logging is great for getting visibility into PowerShell, except if it's injected into memory. And then endpoint detection and response tooling, some of them will record PowerShell and others won't. So some of the analytics that show up most often in our detections, and I would encourage everyone here to take a look at the threat detection report, because it has a lot more context and a lot more detection guidance than we're going to be able to slam into this one webinar. And to plug our blog too, we're regularly posting about how we've detected specific threats, and those threat detection blog posts often include a lot of information that you can sort of use to start building out detection coverage on your end. So some things that we look out for that we found useful in detecting PowerShell that's malicious: encoded commands, base 64 strings, and sort of obfuscation characters like carets are all pretty useful. I was talking to one of our detection engineers who used to be a system administrator recently, and he was saying, in the many years that he was a system administrator and the many times that he used PowerShell, he never found a single reason to obfuscate his PowerShell. So that's not to say that all encoded or obfuscated PowerShell is malicious. Who knows, there could be some tools that do it for some reason, but it warrants attention if you're seeing that come across your network. Of course, that's going to be environmentally specific. So some organizations looking for obfuscated PowerShell is going to be a very good indicator of malice. Other organizations, that's just going to send you down a road toward false positive nightmare. So some other things we look out for are suspicious command line parameters. Those are things like download string, invoke web request, you know, places where PowerShell is the process and you're seeing external network connections in the command line to sort of suspicious URLs. And then finally, unusual process ancestry, like is there ever a reason why Microsoft Office should be spawning PowerShell? And then the second thing that we're seeing like prominently in finance organizations is Windows admin shares. And this, the prevalence of Windows admin shares across our customer set is in no small part due to TrickBot activity. We had a ton of TrickBot activity in 2019. And you know, it's one of the reasons why we saw so many techniques relating to Windows admin shares. So it's number 2 for finance, but it's number 3 overall. It affected just north of a quarter of our customers, which is pretty high, and had nearly 2,000 confirmed threats. And as I said, like jumped from just 3% of total threat volume in 2018 to 13% in 2019, and that's due almost entirely to TrickBot. And a lot of the reasons why adversaries use it, I think, are pretty similar to PowerShell. So it's enabled by default on Windows systems. It's routinely used for host management, and it's included in a very wide variety of lateral movement tools, most prominently probably PS-exec. In terms of observing it, so one data source that's particularly useful is process use of network. It typically coincides with a high volume of SMB connections over port 445, but also authentication logs, process monitoring, and process command line parameters can be useful as well. And then it'll coincide with execution from network shares too. So things to look out for, as I mentioned before, like high volumes of network connections over port 445. And then also sort of a mix of process execution where you're seeing command.exe with parameters that relate to localhost and admin shares. Problematically, like kind of also similar to PowerShell, admin shares are pretty common, but they're not always used in uniform ways. So detection strategies can be false positive prone, and like tuning and suppression are probably going to be important, and you're probably going to have to do more of it if you're at a larger organization. And then the last of these techniques that we've been seeing a lot of is the third place for finance rather is credential dumping. So I know I told you that we only wrote analysis pages for our top 10. That wasn't entirely true because we initially thought maybe we wanted to count for the threat detection report by total, by the number of organizations affected rather than the overall threat volume. So we ended up writing like an initial top 10 that included credential dumping, and then we decided to count a different way and it fell out of the top 10. But we also decided that like, just because it wasn't in the top 10 didn't mean it wasn't important. Like when credential dumping happens, the impact is quite high. So we also included it in our analyses. And so it was ranked 11th overall. We had 762 confirmed threats and it affected 32% of organizations. So why credential dumping? Well, legit creds are a really good way to access a system that you want to access, right? And because of that, they are bought and sold on criminal markets very commonly. Frankly, like users are not great at credential management, and oftentimes the end user is left responsible for managing their credentials. Beyond that, like adversaries effectively need credentials to do a lot of things, and then similar to the other two techniques, there are a bunch of prominent and popular credential dumping tools, like most notably Mimikatz. So to observe it, process monitoring is useful if you want to look for malicious binaries and LSAS. The process command line parameters and PowerShell logs can be useful also if you know like certain malicious command line interface syntaxes to look for. API monitoring can also work if you want to track on sort of what's connecting to your domain controllers, and then file monitoring can be useful in conjunction with the rest. So I jumped ahead of myself there. So some of the things that showed up a lot in the detectors that sort of fired most commonly across the Red Canary customer base were unknown or malicious processes injecting into LSAS, domain name or domain controller connections from unusual IP addresses, sort of this registry usage with command lines like this regsave HKML or SAM here, which is basically a way of dumping creds, were all sort of good ways of that we've found of detecting these things. Now, it should be noted that like Red Canary operates at scale, so some of the things that we've found useful for detecting malice might not work for an individual organization, or they might work a whole lot better. You know, kind of depends on your size and what's going on in your network. So this is sort of a hard transition here, but I wanted to transition to like look at what detection coverage looks like for a given technique in Red Canary. So this is PowerShell. Here on the right-hand side, you can see all of the analytics that we have developed to detect malicious uses of PowerShell. So that's probably like, I don't know, maybe 70 or 80 different analytics. And you know, each of them is effectively a different way of detecting PowerShell. So this one here is the encoded command switch that we were talking about in the PowerShell section. And you know, I just thought it might be useful to sort of understand this, since like for each of the top 10 techniques, we kind of have this, maybe not exactly this level of depth of coverage, but a good amount of depth of coverage around that technique. So in the spirit of hard transitions, that's kind of the last slide I had for us. If anyone has any questions, feel free to fire away. That goes for you, JT. I kind of just talked about a bunch of things.
No, if you want to go back to that last slide just a little bit, because I think it's worth just even from a talking point perspective, is you notice the color coding there in your demo environment. You know, I think you know, someone that might be looking at this slide say, okay, well, wait a second, malicious software hacking tool, why is that yellow and not red, right? And maybe talking about how I know you spoke to this a little bit earlier on from that petabyte of data, how it gets distilled down and then looked at. But how, you know, the risk categorization might apply there, especially with, you know, in this particular instance with PowerShell detection, because not every detection is right the same. It doesn't necessarily all equal, oh my gosh, I've got an alert, now I'm compromised, right? So that might be helpful just to talk about there.
Yeah, the red, yellow, and the red and yellow coloring is it shows you whether the detection is high severity or medium severity. And that's kind of dependent on a lot of things. I think the more clear thing to talk about is you also notice here that some of these are malicious and some of these are suspicious. Malicious activity or malicious software, like that's cases where we know what we're looking at, we know what it is, and we know that it's malware or in some other way malicious. Suspicious activity is where we can't quite pin down exactly what it is, but we know that it's sketchy and that it warrants looking at. And like even though we push suspicious detections associated with suspicious activity where we can't tie the activity to like a specific tool, we still have a false positive rate that's like somewhere less than 1%, right? So even though we have this classification for suspicious activity that might sound kind of gray, it really isn't, right? It's we're not just pushing, you know, willy-nilly things that we don't understand to the customers. Like these are all still threats. We just can't really tie it to something very specific. And that's why you can see here that it isn't a one-to-one, like there isn't one-to-one alignment with suspicious being medium severity. Like suspicious stuff is very often high severity as well.
No, I appreciate that. I think that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, and then as I sort of said throughout the presentation, Like a lot of this stuff is drawn from our 2020 threat detection report, which is a great resource for anybody who's looking to build out detection strategies for the things that we think are most likely to occur. So like the central question that we tried to answer with the first version of the threat detection report was like, how do I get started with MITRE attack? Because I mean, it's this big overwhelming matrix with, I don't even know how much it's got in it now with sub techniques, but it had like 280 some techniques in it. And, you know, just throwing pasta at that and like randomly picking techniques to try and build detection for is not a very good strategy. Like it's a better strategy to try and figure out which things are going to occur most often, and then sort of rank and stack them accordingly. So that's basically what we were trying to figure out is, you know, which of these techniques happens most often. Like that's one way to go about prioritization. Another way to go about prioritization is like, which of these things are like maybe not as prevalent, but when they do happen, they're very bad. So like take those two things, meld them like with what is detectable and what isn't, and then go start building out detection accordingly. So yeah, you can check out the threat detection report at that link. Also linking to MITRE attack here. If you're not familiar with that, it's definitely worth perusing around.
I got a question from the audience. Someone asked, does the systems, which I'm assuming they're talking about that Red Canary system there in the end for threat detection, does it suggest a strategy or just notify users?
So I'll take the first crack at this, and then I think JT probably has a good answer to this as well. First thing it does is notify users, and it allows them to automate certain, you know, like response actions on top of that. However, the customers all have access to dedicated 24/7 incident handling support. So that's where you would go then if you needed help figuring out what to then do. Or I suspect through, you know, one of our partners like Richey May, right, JT?
Yep, that's a great segue there. And so, you know, breaking it down from the software side, you obviously, we talked about the playbooks earlier on, you know, having those playbooks and the suggested actions executed, and then, you know, being notified, hey, we took the following actions and the machine's isolated, or we deleted the binary, or whatever the playbook execution is. And then for many alerts, that's as much as you really need. You know, going a little step further, you know, working with someone like Richey May, alert comes in, you've isolated a host, but now you need to really dig in a little bit more. What happened with this incident? Is there a broader attack going on, and this is just a fraction of it? And how do we address that? And that's a lot of what we do for our clients is stepping in and helping with that, and working in tandem with the threat team over Red Canary. And then on the third side, and this is a real world example, we had a client was running Red Canary in their environment, and they outsourced their IT services to a third party. The IT services company, like many IT services companies, used an endpoint management tool for remote support and patching and things of that nature. There was a vulnerability in that endpoint management software that had been patched, but not patched by the management company. And so the threat actors took over the patch management system and started pushing crypto mining software out to all the hosts under management. So instead of hacking one organization and moving laterally, it was much easier to hack a IT management company and just impact all the assets that they managed across multiple companies. What happened is Red Canary detected the threat as it was rolling across the environment. So if you think about it, it was almost like Christmas tree lights, because you had the green lights turning red as the patch management software was installing the malware across the customer's environment. What we actually did in this instance was utilize Red Canary to isolate all the uninfected hosts so to stop the spread of the crypto mining software, and then working with the incident handling team, and this was all after hours. They wrote a custom removal script. Working in conjunction together, we discovered what the actual initial point entry and what the vulnerability was. And then we actually pulled the IT management services company onto a voice bridge and walked them through what the attack was, how to remediate the vulnerability, and we actually provided them the cleanup script as well that Red Canary wrote. So all in all, those are really the three scenarios. So you've got automation, you've got leveraging a partner such as ours, and then when the attack really is widespread and you need a lot of heavy lifting, the talent there in the threat handling team is great, and all that was included within the subscription service that both Richey May and Red Canary provided to the client.
That's a great story.
Cool. I think
Yeah,
that's
it was a
pretty
fun time.
Their question. I did have one more, which is kind of about, I guess you would call it the supply chain. You guys touched on how sometimes these weak points, like especially in like a wire fraud type scenario or a ransomware type scenario, might be from a vendor or a partner that a company is working with in financial services. So like that example of a mortgage company and a title company. Does this, type of system help mitigate any of those sort of threats, or is that something that is really on the partner, and then it's just about evaluating their cybersecurity stance before you work with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, like any good question, the answer is dependent, right? Like if it's simply a matter of a malicious email coming in and a finance person wiring money, then we may well not have the visibility to see that. But if there are any actions that emanate from the email, right? Like if there's any malware involved, if there's any behaviors that occur on the endpoint that aren't merely happening via sent emails, then there's a very good possibility that we will see it. Yeah,
and building on that, I think that's really the crux of only being as secure as the weakest chain in your, or weakest link in your supply chain. And first and foremost, the best solution to a lot of that, and it's not technical in nature at all. It's education, right? It's educating your end users about what some of these attack methodologies are. It's leveraging blog posts from security researchers and industry specialists that are following these attacks and making sure that you're staying apprised of what's going on and notifying not just your employees, but having very succinct conversations with your partners, because many vendor management programs are very point in time based, meaning it's either at the time of onboarding or in some organizations where it's a little bit more mature, it's once a year. And so while you should be having that conversation on what their cybersecurity maturity is and what they're doing from a control perspective, we're all proverbially into this together, right? And talking with your employees and educating them, talking to your partners about things that you're seeing and educating them are key. And then having additional layers of security like Red Canary in place, as Brian mentioned. If the activity actually happens on the endpoint once something's executed, there's visibility into that. But if the attacker changes the communication channel, it's via SMS, the thing that you're relying on from a security perspective is the person executing the transaction, right? That's that human element. And so it's really making sure that you're staying apprised, either through a partner or internal resources of what's going on from a trend perspective, and educating your employees.
Well stated. Defense in depth includes employee education as well.
It always comes back to the people. I haven't seen any other questions come in. I did have one person ask for these links to be pasted in the chat. They are pasted in there if you wanted to click on them and bookmark them really quick so that you can check out that threat detection report. you can go ahead and do that. Like I said before, within the next couple of days, you will see the slides and recording come to you via email. Again, share that with anyone that you think would be interested in that. And then, of course, those slides early on in the presentation have both JT and Brian's contact information on there. Feel free to ask us, any questions that you have about cybersecurity. We're always here to help. It can be a really, kind of stressful topic. So we always try to be welcoming of, questions and things from people in our key industry of financial services. So thanks again for attending, and look out for those slides in your email in the next couple of days.
Yeah. Again, thanks everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Yep, thanks for having me.